Hey everyone, welcome to another Flutter tutorial. In this video, we'll be looking at creating an OAuth service that's easy to maintain and easy to extend. That is to add new services over time as needs be. We'll be looking at implementing the three primary services that we tend to see in our OAuth login. That is the Apple sign-in service, the Google sign-in service, and also the Facebook login service. What we'll not be doing in this video is configuring each service in their respective dashboards. That is up to you guys to go through the respective service dashboard and to configure those services. We can find further information on how those can be configured from each of the Flutter packages. So if you go through, for example, the Google sign-in Flutter package, then you can see how that service can be configured. So we'll be mainly just focusing on the implementation of each service in this module in a way that's testable and easy to maintain and reuse. So let's get started. And to get started with this, I have configured or pre-set up the project, and you guys can find the starter package over on GitHub. There in this branch, the starter branch, you can check out that branch and have all the dependencies already configured and ready to go. So what I've done so far is to add those packages that we'll be using. These three packages, the Flutter, Facebook Auth, the Google sign-in, and also the sign-in with Apple. I've also added the HTTP package since we'll be needing to make some HTTP requests. And for testing, I have added the mocktail package. Also, if you go inside of the lib folder, you can see there's an OAuth folder where I've also added a result model that which is basically a data class that holds the result of a response. So I've set this up in such a way that will return a result that will be a success that holds the value of that result, or a failure when we make our HTTP calls. I've also created an OAuth user which represents the information from the different OAuth services that we'll be fetching when we access those services. So to get started, the first thing I want to do is to go inside of our providers folder. This is where we'll have our different OAuth providers. And I'm going to create a OAuth provider contract. And this contract will have those methods that we need to implement whenever we're adding new OAuth services to this module. So I'm going to create an enum which holds the OAuth type. And for now, the three OAuth types that we're looking at is our Facebook, Google, and Apple, not Twitter. Those are the three types that we're focusing on in this video. So those are the OAuth types. And what I'm going to do also is to create an extension method that handles the different OAuth types and return the correct value based on the selected OAuth type. So I'm going to call this OAuth type value. I'm going to extend that on OAuth type. So the first thing is to get the string value. And I'm going to split that and return the last value. And this will return the string representation of each OAuth type. That is Facebook, Google, or Apple. The next method I want to add is to add a static method which returns the OAuth type based on the string that I pass in. So I will pass in a string here, and then it will check the values in the OAuth type and returns the correct OAuth type that represent that string. So now we have our OAuth types and we have our extension method. Let's go ahead and create our abstract. We'll create our contract, OAuth provider. And I'm just gonna so now we'll want a login method and also a logout method. Those are the two methods that we want. So let's get rid of these. And for this, I want to return a result of type OAuth user. So let's return result. Let's bring those in. And for our logout, I simply want to return a Boolean, which determines if we're logged out or not. So these are the two methods for our provider, or OAuth provider, that each OAuth implementation must abide by. So now we can go ahead and create each implementation. So first, I'm going to create our Google Auth service. So we say class Google Auth, and this will implement our provider. Let's create those methods. And now for our dependencies, we want a Google sign-in. And we also want a HTTP client. So I'll get the client from the HTTP package. So we can import that from the HTTP package. So those are two dependencies for the Google Auth provider. So let's now create our constructor, and I'll call this Google Auth provider. So Google Auth provider. So I'm going to make this a optional param. So this will be a Google sign-in optional param here, Google sign-in. Then I'm going to require this param right here, the client. Move this here. Then what I want to do is that I'm going to set the Google sign-in to the value that is passed in, or I'm going to initialize the Google sign-in here with the scopes. So I'm going to add the scopes here. In this case, I want the email and the profile. So now we have our constructor, which accepts a optional Google sign-in. If that Google sign-in is passed in, then we use that. Otherwise, we create a Google sign-in for ourselves with the email and profile. And I'm doing it as an optional parameter for testability reasons, so that when it's time to test, we can pass in a mock version of the Google sign-in right here. So for our login method, let's implement our login method. So the first thing I want to do is to get a handle on the Google account. So the Google sign-in account. So I'm going to get a handle on that. And I'm going to create a private method called handle sign-in. Let's create that method, which will return a future Google sign-in account. So as you can see, I have GitHub Copilot working with me. That's why you see those code suggestions, which it's basically analyzing my coding style, codes that I've written before, and is making those suggestions. So it's a handy tool to have while working. So for my method here, I'm going to say Google sign-in account, and I'm going to call this the current user. Then I'm going to try and get the current user. Otherwise, if there's no user, I print the error and return the user. So that's the handle signed in account. So now I'm going to check that user. So I'm going to say if that Google account is null, then I want to return error. So in this case, I want to return a result, a failure result. So I'm going to say result of type OAuth user dot failure, and I'm going to pass the failure message here, which is Google sign-in failed, but our failure message accepts an array of strings. So I'm going to pass that here. So now we return the failure. Otherwise, if there's no failure, then we can get the OAuth user by fetching the information from Google server. So I'm going to say final result of type OAuth user info equals to await fetch user info, and here I'm going to pass in the Google sign-in account. Again, I'm going to create that method to fetch the user info here. Let's accept Copilot suggestion and then remove all these just to get the function signature. So what I'm going to do now is to say I'm going to get the headers. So string, type string, so I'm going to say the Google sign-in account dot headers. So I'm going to get the headers from that. Let me change this to current user instead. So I'm going to get the headers from the current user. Then I'm going to make a request to Google server. using the HTTP client. So we're going to say client.get. Now what we're getting, URI. I'm going to parse the URI, accept Copilot suggestion, but instead of this URL, I'm going to copy and paste the required URL. So the URL we'll be using is a Google API's people URL, and we'll pass in the different fields that we require, which is the names, email address, and phone numbers. Those are the fields that we are fetching from the people API. And also for the headers, let's create the header by setting the authorization code to the authorization code that we receive from the current user from the headers there. So now we make that request. Let's go ahead and parse that request. So first, I'm going to say if the request fails, that is, if the status code is not 200, then what I'm going to do is return that error, which is failed Google sign-in fail. Otherwise, let's go ahead and parse the user data. So I'm going to say data. I'm going to go ahead and say JSON decode result.body. So I know that from Google's server, the result that is returned from Google, there's a possibility that the phone number JSON string doesn't exist any at all. So what I'm going to do is to first, I'm going to check that. So I'm going to say phone number equals to data, and I'm going to get the phone number and check if it nulls. Check if this field exists. If this field exists, then what I'm going to do is to strip the phone numbers from the response. So in this case, I know from Google's result that I've looked at before that the phone number would be at data phone numbers 0, then there is a canonical form, and I'm going to say to string. So if the phone number JSON object exists or JSON key exists, then let's strip the phone, get the phone number from that. Otherwise, we set the phone number to null. Now we can create our OAuth user and return our OAuth user. So I'm going to say OAuth user equals to OAuth user first name, get the given name, and I'm going to cast these to string. The last name, which is a family name, cast that to string, and the email address, cast that to string also. Then we have our phone number and also our photo URL. So now we can return our results, and I'm going to say success. Here we pass in our user, in this case, our OAuth user. So back to our login method now. We say, okay, we fetch the user info. Then we check if there's a failure. So if user info dot failure, if there's a failure, then what we want to do is first log out so that we can disconnect from our Google sign-in service, since we would have already connect from here. So what we want to do is to disconnect, and after we disconnect, then we can return the failure. So in this case, we can just go ahead and return user info. Whether it's a failure or not, we'll return the user info. But if it's a failure, we want to disconnect before we return. So that's our login method. And for the logout method, it's pretty simple. All we need to do is to say await Google sign in, we disconnect, and then we return a Boolean value. So in this case, we'll say Google sign in, and we can check if the user is signed in or not. Google sign. That we check if the user is signed in. If not, return false. Otherwise, return true. So if the user is not signed in, we return true, that the logout was successful. So that's our Google sign in provider. Now let's go ahead and create a test file to test our Google sign in provider. So here inside of our tests, let's create a providers folder. Let's say Google Auth tests. So for our tests, there are a few mock classes that we'll want to get set up so that our tests can be executed, mimicking exactly how it would run on Google server. And since we are not, as I said before, we are not going to configure these services inside of the developer console, then the test is the next best bet, the closest thing we can get to see how our implementation will behave. So to get this up and running, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a few mock classes that will be needed in each test. So I'm going to first create a mock client that's going to implement HTTP client, next I'll create a mock Google sign in object. So Google sign in, let's import that also. And also I want to create a fake Google sign in account. So I'm going to create a Google sign in account, but in this case, instead of a mock, I'm going to create a fake, and I'm going to override a few methods here. So one, I want to override the auth headers, and the auth headers should return a authorization string, the bearer token, and also X Google Auth user. So these are the expected headers whenever we make a request to the Google server, so that when Google provides us a Google sign-in account, it also passes along these headers, which we are faking to get our service running when we are testing. So we can also override a few things. For example, we can override the email and let that returns some string email. We can also override the ID and also the photo URL. So now we have our fake Google sign-in account. Let's override the hash code. Pass in those fields that we have created. So now we can get into our testing. Let's create the dependencies. In this case, let's create our Google Auth provider, since that's what we're testing. That's the system under test. We'll also create our mock client and also the mock Google sign-in account. Then inside of our setup, we can go ahead and configure those. So now we have our client, we have our Google sign-in, and then we pass those into the provider as the dependency. Let's go ahead and import Flutter tests. Now we have our setup, and for our setup all, I want to create a register a fallback for our URI. This will be needed since we're using Mocktail. We have to register this fallback URI in order for those stubs to work, especially when we're passing a URL. So I have gone ahead and created our tests, and these tests are for our Google login method, or the provider login method. So the first test I have here is I'm testing that it should return errors when Google doesn't return a valid account. So for that test, I'm using the mock Google sign-in. I'm calling the sign-in method, and then I'm stubbing that to return a null value, which reflects Google returning some null value whenever we try to sign in. Then I'm going to say call our Google Auth provider, calls the login method, and check the results. And in this case, I'm expecting a failure since the Google sign-in returns null. So if we run this test, so we can see that our test is passing there. Similar test here is that we should return some form of error when the Google server throws error. That is, whenever we try to fetch or sign in, but there's some kind of exception or error thrown by Google. So in this case, we say if there's an exception, then we also need a failure. So let's run that test. Test is passing. And then this test is for when we have a Google account, we get a Google sign-in account, but when we try to fetch the user information from the Google server, then there's an error. So we stop the Google sign-in to say return the mock Google sign-in client account, the mock Google sign-in account. Then we are going to disconnect if there's any connection. If there's any connection that exists, or if we call disconnect, we're going to return null. Then if Google is signed in is call, we'll return false. then whenever our client gets called to fetch the user information from the URL, that is this part of the code right here, whenever this is called, then what we're going to do is to respond with a status code 400 and an empty body. So this should also return a failure. In this case, our test is also passing. For our next test, we are now testing if everything is successful. So in this case, we should return a user, an auth user, when everything is authenticated successfully. So we call our Google sign-in here, we return our mock Google signed-in account. Then whenever we call Google server for the user information, then we return the user information along with that 200 status code. And I have created this method that reflects the JSON object that is returned from Google. So here we have how Google normally return that object. We have names, then we have the display name, family name, and the different fields. We have the email addresses, and we have the phone number in its canonical form, the type, and I got this directly from Google Playground, so I know that this is a format which Google returns to us. So I created this as stub data. So I'm expecting that it should return the Google JSON object with a valid user and also the 200 status code. So if we run that, we can see that the test is passing, so that success with the result is success, and the email is the email that we have here in the email addresses. So that is our Google Auth service, and we use our test to validate our code since we are not configuring the test in the Google dashboard, Google Developer Console. So we're not going to test it like that. We're writing unit tests to validate our code. So now we can go on and create our other OAuth service. In this case, we'll be creating our Facebook OAuth service. So let's go to our providers. Let's create our Facebook Auth. So let's create our Facebook Auth provider. This will implement our Auth provider. Let's create those overrides. And now for our dependency, all we need is to access the Facebook Auth service. So let us say Facebook Auth. I'm not going to set the instance here. I'm going to pass that in as a dependency. Again, for testing purposes, since I want to pass in a mock version, I'm going to make this optional. Then I'm going to set it to the Facebook instance if it's not provided. So whenever we're using the production code, then it will use this instance. Whenever we're testing, it will use the instance that we pass in. So now for our login, let's implement that. We can use Facebook's login results, and we can say await Facebook login. Next, we can check the result here. So we can say if the result status is not equal to the Facebook login status success. If it's not success, then we can return a failure here. So in this case, we'll return our OAuth user will return a failure, and we'll return the message failed to sign in. So once there's a failure, when we call Facebook logging service, then we can return that failure. Otherwise, if there's no failure, we can go ahead and fetch the user. So I'm going to say final result, again of type OAuth user, this case, I'm going to create another method, which is to fetch the user. Let's create that private method here. Future should return a result of type OAuth user, fetch user, so now I'm going to say inside a try catch block, let's go ahead and say final user data, and we can access this from Facebook. So let's say await Facebook auth, we get user data, and we can pass in the fields that we want. So in this case, we want the first name, we want the last name, email, and also picture. And the picture with the width of 200. This is more like the thumbnail picture. So now, once we have our user data, we can go ahead and create our auth user from the user data. Again, I'm going to strip out the photo URL, since I know that from Facebook service, there's a possibility that the picture JSON field does not exist, and that might cause error if I try to reference a field that does not exist. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to check if it exists first. So here, I'm going to say user data picture. If it's not equal to null, the same thing that I did on the Google services side for the phone number. So if it's not equal to null, then I can say picture data URL. And let's get this to string, otherwise null. Now I can get my OAuth user from that. So let's go ahead and create our OAuth user. And I will get the first name from the user data, get the last name, get the email address, and also the photo URL. Then I can go ahead and return that user. So I'll return the result, which is success. and return the user. We'll return our auth user here. Then if there is a failure where there is some error, then we can simply copy this error message here and return the error. So that's it for our Facebook sign in. And here we simply return fetch user. The logout is fairly simple. Also, again, inside of a try catch block, we simply call Facebook logout and we return true. Or in this case, we return false. And that's our logout method. So now that we have our Facebook implementation here, we can go ahead and test our implementation. So Facebook auth test. I'm just going to rename this file. Auth provider. So for this test, all we need is a simple mock of the Facebook service. In this case, the Facebook auth service. We'll mock that. And we'll use that as our dependency. We can go ahead, set up our test. System under test. And then we'll make our mock auth. Inside of our setup method, we'll initialize those. Let's import the Flutter test library. Now we can begin writing our test, which I'm going to write and then explain. So I've gone ahead and written those tests, and now we can check them and look at them. So the first test here, again, we're looking for errors if Facebook login fails. So for our mock Facebook auth service, what we do is to say whenever login is called, that is, whenever we called Facebook login right here, whenever this method is called, then what we're going to do is to return a login result with a failure. And we're expecting our result to be a failure also. So let's run that and test that. As you can see, that test is passing. For our next test, we are checking that if there's an error when fetching the user data, then we should expect a failure also. So we say that whenever we call Facebook login, the login result will be a success. So that portion of the call is successful. So we are forcing it to be successful. Then whenever we call the get user data method, that's where we are throwing the error. We are throwing an exception here to suggest that this call fails, and from that we are expecting that our result should be a failure result, since there was a failure in fetching the user data. So if we execute that test, There we go. That's passing also. Then the final test is to check if everything authenticates successfully. So in this case, whenever we log in, then we expect to get a login result of success. And whenever we call get user data, then we expect a successful response with the appropriate JSON object. And in this case, I've created this method which represents the JSON object that is returned from Facebook. So in this case, Facebook returned this JSON format. So this is a template of that format with the email, the ID, the first name, last name, and the picture. Picture data, which has a height, silhouette, URL, and the width. So now, if we run this test, then our test is passing. And from that, we are pretty confident that our implementation is accurate. And even though we have not configured the service in Facebook's developer console yet, once we configure them and hook them up to our UI, we can be confident that they are working because we have created our test to really represent how the data is fetched and passed from Facebook's service. So now that we have our Google service completed, we have our Facebook service completed, we can go ahead and create our final service. And in this case, we are going to create our Apple provider, which is slightly different from the others. So here we want our Apple Auth. And with this one, you can't test it on a device unless you have the Apple Developer Membership Program. So this one is even harder to test, even if you are testing it on a physical device. So we'll have to mock up a lot of things to get as best result as possible. So let's go ahead and create our class for that. So Apple Auth provider. Again, this will implement our OAuth provider. And for its dependency, I am going to need the Apple authorization ID. So this is, I'm going to need this, but instead of using this, what I'm going to do is to create a type definition, and which I'm going to call Apple sign in, and this is going to be a future. It's going to be a function future of type which returns type authorization credential ID, and it's gonna accept a string, and I'm gonna pass in a nuanced here, which is required by Apple for security purposes. So now for my dependency, I'm gonna say Apple sign in, which is a type that I've just created. I'm gonna call that sign in with Apple. Then I'm gonna have another function, which is another function signature, type bool, which is, I'm gonna call is available, which determines if Apple sign in is available on the device or not. So now inside of my constructor, go ahead, let's say auth provider. I'm going to remove these required fields, and I'm going to make both of these optional so that we can pass them in as mock functions for testing purposes, because outside of passing these as mock methods to force our system to behave as we expect Apple system to behave, it's kind of difficult to test it if you do not have a developer membership with Apple. So I'm going to say, okay, sign in with Apple is equal to sign in with Apple if it's available, or I'm going to create a private method here that says Apple sign in. So it's either the one that I pass in or the method that already exists. And the same thing with is available. So it's either the one that's passed in or the method that I'll be creating here, which is Apple is available. So let's go ahead and create those methods. So because Apple sign in, or the sign in with Apple package, uses static methods, therefore I have to make this method static also. So let's go ahead and say static future or authorization ID, credential ID underscore Apple sign in, which accept the nonce. Then I'm gonna call the sign in with Apple from the package, from the sign in with Apple package, get ID with credential. I'm gonna pass in the scopes, email, full name, and also pass in the nuanced right there. So that's our sign in with Apple method. And the same thing for our is available. So we have to create a static method, Apple is available, and we can simply call the sign in with Apple wrapper class there and call the is available method. This is coming from the sign in with Apple package. So for our login method now, let's go ahead and implement that. We can simply say first we check if Apple sign in is available. So let's go ahead and say if that's available. So let's await. If that's not available, then we can go ahead and return error. So if we can return immediately with a failure saying that Apple sign in is unavailable. Otherwise, if Apple sign in is available, let us go ahead and generate our nonce here. Then we can say so this is the raw nonce that's generated, and then we can convert it from string to the correct format. So here I'll create a function called SHA-256 of string, and we'll pass in the raw nonce there. So let's go ahead and create that method. So we create this method which returns the hash of the input in hex notation. So we pass in the raw nonce, and then it will return this version of it. So now we'll need to import this from, we'll need to add to our dependencies this cryptographic package. So let's save that, build our dependencies. Then we can go ahead and import that library so we can have access to the digest class. So now that we have that, we have our N1s. Now we can try and sign in. So we have a try catch block here. Inside that, we're going to say final authorization credential Apple ID. Equals to await, sign in with Apple, and we pass the nuanced here. Then we can say return result dot success, and our result must be of type OAuth user. Then we can create our OAuth user here by saying OAuth user, and we can get the first name from the Apple credential, which is can get the email, can get the last name, which is the family name from the Apple credential, family name. And let's remove this. So we get that information. That's the most information we can get from Apple at this moment. Otherwise, if there's an error, we can return this failure right here. So we failed to sign in with Apple. And that's our login method. For our logout, it's pretty simple. Here we simply returns true, since there is no logout method inside of the Apple sign-in package. So we can just simply return true, and the logout will have to be handled from our server side of things. So once we return true here, then we can log out that user from our server. So that's it for Apple sign-in implementation. We can go ahead now and write a test. So let's see for Apple Auth tests. So again, the issue with testing the Apple sign-in package is that it uses mostly static methods, and it's hard to mock static methods. So what we're going to do is to create a wrapper around those static methods, then we mock that wrapper. So we're going to create a class here. I'm going to call it static methods wrapper, and this class will hold both those two methods that we need, which is the available and the is available and the get credentials. So let's create those methods. Future bool is available. This will return true, and then we need the get credential method. This will return a future authorization credential applied. This method accepts a list of required scopes. So there's the required scopes. So list of Apple ID authorization scopes. So we call those scopes, and also an optional string of the nuance value. So here we're just going to return future that value. And I'm just going to ignore the warning for now. So there we create our static methods wrapper. Then we're able to now mock that wrapper. So mocks, we're gonna say mock static methods wrapper, and we are going to mock that. So now we have those mock. We can go ahead and set up our test. Let's create our Apple Auth provider, which is our system under test, and we'll create our static methods. So in this case, I'm just going to call this mocks. Then inside of our setup, we can go ahead and set that up. So now for isAvailable function, we're going to use our mock method here. And for sign in with Apple, we are going to say, we're going to pass it a method here. Which calls our mock credentials with empty scopes and the nonce that's passed. So now we can write our test and test this system. So I'm just going to add those tests, then explain them. So now we have our test set up. We can test our implementation and see how it fares. So now our first test is that it should return error when the Apple sign-in is not available. So if we are on Android or some system that sign-in is not available, then whenever we click the Apple sign-in button, I am forcing the isAvailable method here to return false, as it would return false in that condition. So whenever we call login on our Apple sign-in provider, we are expecting a failure if the Apple sign-in is not available. So let's run that test. There we have that test passing. The next test is that we should return errors when Apple server throws an error. So Apple sign-in is available, as we are forcing it to return true here to say yes, Apple sign-in is available. But whenever we reach out to Apple servers for the credentials, for the user information, then there's an exception return. And we are expecting that our result should be a failure also. So if we run that, we can see that our test is passing here. So just by this green tick. The next test is that it should return the user when the Apple authentication is successful. So now we have Apple sign-in is available, and whenever we call to Apple's server pass in the scopes, pass in the nodes, then an Apple server returns. It's going to return with an authorization credential Apple ID with the user information. So it's going to return this object with the user information, the authorization code, the email, family name, given name, identity token, state, user identifier. But we are only interested in fetching these 3 fields here. So in this case, we are expecting the result to be success, and we are expecting the user email to be the email that's passed or returned from Apple. So we run that, and as you can see, our test is passing here. So we have good confidence that our implementation of Apple's sign-in will work when we connect that to our button, when we configure that, in the sense that we have our Apple developer membership and we configure that inside of Apple's developer console. Then we are confident by our test that our code should work. So that is our Apple sign-in also. And what we can do is that if we need to add more OAuth services, for example, Twitter, we can add Twitter here and create the implementation, create the test, and so we can easily extend the different OAuth services we have in this module. So we can easily go to our main here, and we can reference any of those modules or those services here. So we can reference our Google Auth provider here. We'd have to pass in the necessary arguments. We can reference our Apple Auth provider here. And we can also reference our Facebook Auth provider. And we have each of them so that we can access it. Even though this is not the best thing to do, the best thing would be to create another service like an Auth service that serves as somewhat of a manager or a factory, where you pass in the specific type that you want. So you would pass in based on the providers that we have in this case, the Auth type. So you'd have a manager or a factory that you pass in either Facebook, Google, and that would return the correct instance, and that you could use that whenever you like. But that's how we create our OAuth module that is extendable, that's easily tested and maintained, and we can reuse this in all of our different Flutter projects. So thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you enjoy this video, and I'll post the final code also on GitHub. So thank you once again, and see you in the next one.